Hey everyone, in this video we're going to go over adding an array field in JsDbg. I'm currently looking at CNN.com in Chromium. I've broken into it with my debugger and launched JsDbg to view the DOM tree for CNN.com. My scenario is I want to look at all of the attribute nodes associated with a given element. The attribute nodes are stored in an attr node list off of the rare data object for elements. So by pivoting here, we should see all elements that have an attribute node associated with it. So let's try to find one on this page. So right here we have a pointer to the attr node list. If we expand that, we will see that the attr node list is implemented as a blink heap vector, and this particular vector has a size of 7, which presumably means that it has 7 attribute nodes in it. However, there's no way for us to interact with most of those attribute nodes. All we have is a pointer to this buffer, which I suspect is an array, and so we can really only see the first entry. This is where an array field would come in handy and allow us to look at any of the attribute nodes. So before we start implementing that, let's look at how we would do this in WinDbg. Let's start with this HTML element right here. And let's dump that. Okay. Now we need to get to the element rare data. We start off with this rare data base. I can take this pointer and cast it down into an element rare data type. Alright, so now we have access to our attr node list. So it looks like there are already some native visualizers for WinDbg here that give us more convenient views. However, since we're working with JsDbg, we don't really have access to those. Therefore, to emulate that debugging experience, we're going to look at the raw view. And in the raw view, we see that the blink heap vector is backed by a WTF vector. Specifically, it's a specialization of the WTF vector. WTF stands for Web Template Framework. It is a collection of standard types that are used across many parts of the WebKit codebase. And if we look at the raw view for that, we see exactly what we saw in JsDbg. So our suspicion is that this buffer is actually an array, and it contains 7 entries because that's the size. So let's try to dump that. Okay, that was a little slow, but it looks like it was able to dump them successfully. All the pointers look reasonable. So yes, this buffer that backs the WTF vector does seem like an array. All right, so now let's look at how we can implement this as an array field for JsDbg. So there's already an extension called WTF helpers, which has helpers for various other WTF types. We don't have one yet for the elements of a vector, so we can add that. Since we're adding an array field, I think a good place to start would be to just copy this one for the hash table and modify it. So let's first look at the signature of this add array field function. So as input, it takes an input type or a function that takes an input type and returns true or false. This function mode is useful in the case of WTF vectors or other things that involve regexes or predicates. You can give it a name. You also need to provide the return type. You can either provide the type directly or a function that takes the type and returns a string that represents the name of the return type. And finally, a getter, which returns an array of debug objects or a promise to an array of debug objects. Okay, so let's try to implement our array field. So we're dealing with WTF vector, and we're passing in a function that says match basically any WTF vector. We don't want to just implement this for heap vectors or for this particular instance of heap vectors, heap vector that allows us to see attribute nodes. We want to make sure this works for all WTF vectors. As a name, let's say elements. Elements of a vector seems pretty natural. The return type really is the first template parameter, so we can extract that here. This is a template parameter to return an array of all of the parameters, and we want to select the first one. Now let's actually implement the getter. So we saw in the debugger that the buffer, or the attribute nodes, are stored in the buffer. More generically speaking, the entries of the vector are stored in the buffer, and we can, and it's an array. So there is an array API that will allow us to conveniently retrieve those. So let's first get the buffer field off of the vector, and then let's pick that up as an array. And we just need to provide a size so that we know how big the array should be, and that can be retrieved from the size field. And that is actually it. So let's refresh JsDbg. And now we have an elements member that has all of the entries in the adder in this vector. You can expand that and interact with any given adder.